At 6:47 in the morning on March 14th, 1944, Sergeant James Crawford lay motionless in a shell crater 200 yards from German lines near Anzio, Italy. 5 enemy spotters had him triangulated. 3 MG-42 machine gun nests waited for movement, any movement at all. In the next 4 hours, he would eliminate every spotter without firing a single shot using a technique his own officers had explicitly forbidden him to use just 2 days earlier. But before we understand how Crawford accomplished what military doctrine said was impossible, we need to go back. Back to a place where most men feared to go. Back to a darkness so complete that your eyes would create phantom lights just to give your brain something to process. Back to Harlan County, Kentucky, where a 12-year-old boy was learning skills that would one day change modern warfare. The year was 1936. The place was Mine Shaft Number 7, 400 feet beneath the Appalachian Mountains, where the coal ran deep and the work ran deeper. James Crawford, everyone called him Jimmy, back then started running messages between shaft crews when he turned 12. His father worked the mines. His uncle worked the mines. By 14, Jimmy would be underground too, doing what mountain boys did, following the path their fathers walked. But Jimmy was different. The other messenger boys carried carbide lamps that lit their way through those tunnels, casting jumping shadows on rock walls that had never seen sunlight. Not Jimmy. He walked through absolute darkness with nothing but his ears and his memory and his sense of the air moving around him. The older miners thought he was showing off. Maybe they thought he was simple, too stubborn to carry a lamp like everyone else. They tolerated his odd ways because the Crawfords were mining people had been for 3 generations. You didn't question how a man did his job if he did it well, and Jimmy Crawford did his job better than boys twice his age. His reasoning was simple but profound, though he never put it quite that way. Lamps ruin your night vision, he told his father once sitting on the porch after a shift. Makes you blind to everything outside that circle of light. But if you learn the sounds, if you learn the smell of different rock faces, if you feel how air pressure changes near ventilation shafts, you don't need to see. Down in those tunnels, Jimmy Crawford learned a language that had nothing to do with words. The drip of water told him limestone deposits were near. That particular pitch, that echo, meant he was approaching Junction 4. The creak of timber meant pressure building somewhere, meant the mountain was settling, meant you needed to pay attention. The scrape of boots told him which crew was where, how far away, whether they were moving toward him or away. He memorized every turn, every junction, every ventilation shaft, not by sight, by sound, by smell, by the feeling of air moving against his skin in that absolute darkness. When you're 400 feet underground where the sun is just a memory, you learn to trust senses most people forget they have. The miners tolerated his methods until August 3rd, 1938. That was the day Section K collapsed, trapping 6 men, including Jimmy's Uncle Robert, 400 feet down, with no light source at all. The timber had been weak there, everyone knew it, but the company pushed them to dig anyway, always pushing for more coal, more production, more profit. When it went fast. A crack like thunder, then the roar of tons of rock and timber coming down, then silence. The kind of silence that fills your chest and makes it hard to breathe. 6 men in absolute darkness. Experienced miners, men who had spent decades underground, men who knew these shafts like they knew their own homes. But in that moment, with all the lamps destroyed in the collapse, they were helpless, disoriented, scared. Because a coal mine in absolute darkness is not like a dark room where you can feel your way to a wall. It's 3-dimensional. It branches, it drops, it narrows to spaces where a man can't fit. One wrong turn means you're crawling deeper instead of climbing out, means you're lost in a maze of rock with your air running out. Except for 14-year-old Jimmy Crawford. He was there because he'd been running a message to his uncle when it happened, got caught on the wrong side of the collapse. He should have been terrified, should have been useless. Instead, he closed his eyes, not that it mattered in that darkness, and listened. The drip of water came from his left. That particular pitch, that resonance meant limestone near ventilation shaft C. The creak of timber, that specific groan, told him Junction 4 was 30 feet ahead. And the smell, faint but present, the smell of fresh air coming from the right-hand passage instead of the left. Everyone hold the belt of the man in front of you, Jimmy said, his voice steady in the darkness. We're going out. For 3 hours, he led 6 grown men through a maze of collapsed passages, never hesitating, never doubting. He navigated by sound and memory and the feel of air moving past his face. When they emerged into Kentucky, sunlight blinking and coughing, the mine superintendent wrote something in Jimmy's file that would appear again 6 years later when the Army tried to figure out what to do with him. James Crawford knows these tunnels better than the engineers who dug them. Exceptional spatial reasoning and non-visual navigation skills. The Army would later discover those skills translated to battlefields better than anyone could have imagined. December 8, 1941. The day after Pearl Harbor, when the radio broadcast turned every American living room into a war room. Jimmy Crawford walked into the recruitment office in Lexington, Kentucky the morning after his 18th birthday. He didn't wait for the draft, didn't wait to see if his mining job would qualify as essential war work. He just went. The recruiting officer looked at his file. Coal mine experience, emergency rescue record, that unusual note about navigation skills. He stamped the papers and sent Jimmy to infantry. By November, he was at Fort Benning, learning to kill people instead of avoiding cave-ins. His instructors noticed something unusual during night training exercises. While other recruits stumbled through darkness with flashlights, tripping over roots, and walking into trees, Jimmy Crawford moved like he could see. He couldn't. He just knew how to listen, knew how to feel the space around him, knew that darkness wasn't an obstacle if you understood it. They made him a scout. By January 1944, Jimmy was in Italy with the 3rd Infantry Division, part of the Anzio beachhead that was supposed to break the German defensive line. It didn't. Instead, 36,000 Allied troops found themselves pinned on a coastal strip 6 miles deep, surrounded by German artillery positions in the Alban Hills. Every movement drew fire. Every position was pre-sighted. Men died fetching water. The problem was German spotters. They worked in pairs, sometimes trios, positioned in ruins and tree lines with radio equipment and binoculars. When they saw Allied troop movement, they called in artillery coordinates. The shells arrived 90 seconds later with a precision that seemed impossible. A company would move up to assault a position, and before they covered 50 yards, German 88s would bracket them with fire so accurate, it was like the shells had eyes. On February 8th, Jimmy Crawford watched through binoculars from his observation post as a platoon from Baker Company got caught in the open during a probe towards Cisterna. The German spotters called it in from a bombed-out farmhouse 400 yards north. 42 men went down before they could reach cover. Jimmy knew 3 of them from the same transport ship crossing the Atlantic. Private James Doherty from Tennessee, 19 years old, who'd shown Jimmy a photo of his girl back home. Her name was Sarah, and she had dark hair and a smile that made Doherty's whole face light up. Corporal Vincent Palmieri from New Jersey, who'd shared his last chocolate bar with Jimmy during a cold night in January when neither of them could sleep. Sergeant First Class Robert Hutchkins from Oregon, who'd promised Jimmy he'd teach him to fly fish after the war, who talked about steelhead rivers and clear mountain streams like other men talked about women. Jimmy watched them die. Watched through binoculars while German artillery walked across Baker Company's position like a giant stomping on insects. He could see the German spotter in that farmhouse 400 yards away, hand on the radio, calling in death with mechanical precision. Jimmy was 200 yards from his own lines, following doctrine, staying at the prescribed safe distance. He might as well have been on the moon. He requested permission to hunt the spotters. His Lieutenant Harrison Webb, a West Point graduate from Connecticut, who believed in doctrine the way some men believe in God, denied it. "We need you for reconnaissance, not revenge missions," Webb told him. The conversation happened in Webb's tent with a kerosene lamp throwing shadows on canvas walls. Jimmy stood at attention because that's what you did, but something inside him was already calculating distances, measuring sight lines, mapping patterns. On February 16th, a sniper team tried to eliminate a spotter nest in the ruins of a church tower near Campoleone. The lead sniper was Private Eric Anderson, a quiet kid from Minnesota who was 21 years old and wrote poetry in the margins of his field manual. Anderson got into position at dawn and took the shot. 300 yards. Perfect conditions. The bullet hit the German spotter center mass. The man collapsed. Anderson lowered his rifle and smiled. Jimmy saw it through his binoculars from 200 yards east. Saw Anderson's face, saw the relief and satisfaction. There, the feeling of a job done right. Then the second spotter, hidden in the bell tower's shadow where Anderson hadn't seen him, radioed coordinates. 30 seconds later, mortar rounds obliterated Anderson's position. They found pieces of him scattered across 40 feet. His rifle was intact, blown clear by the blast. His poetry was gone. His smile was gone. Everything that made Eric Anderson a person instead of a casualty number was just gone. Jimmy requested permission again. Webb denied it again. Doctrine is clear, Webb said. Sniper teams handle spotters. We don't send scouts on elimination missions. The conversation was shorter this time. Jimmy's jaw was tighter. On March 3rd, an entire squad got pinned down trying to clear a German observation post on Hill 73. The spotters positioned in a network of 3 connected positions called in artillery that killed 7 men in 4 minutes. The squad leader was Staff Sergeant Leonard Hayes from Alabama, 28 years old, married to a woman named Martha, who was waiting for him on a 40-acre farm where Hayes planned to plant apple trees. Jimmy had shared a foxhole with Hayes 3 weeks earlier during a particularly brutal shelling. You hunker down in a hole with another man while the world tries to kill you both. You talk about things that matter. Hayes talked about his farm, about Martha, about how he was going to plant Macintosh apples, maybe some Rome beauties too, see which ones grew better in Alabama soil. You ever had fresh Macintosh apples? Crawford Hayes asked. Not the canned stuff, real apples right off the tree, still warm from the sun. Only had what came in cans, Jimmy told him. Well, you come visit when this is over, Hayes said. I'll show you what real apples taste like. Martha makes a pie that'll make you forget every bad thing you ever saw. On March 3rd, Leonard Hayes took a shell fragment through the abdomen. He went down 40 yards from cover, 40 yards that might as well have been 40 miles, because German machine guns covered every inch of ground between him and safety. He called for a medic. The medic tried to reach him, got driven back by machine gun fire. Hayes called for 20 minutes while his life ran out into Italian dirt. Jimmy Crawford watched through binoculars from 200 yards away. Watched Hayes's lips moving, could read what he was saying. Tell Martha about the apple trees. Tell her I love her. Tell her I tried to come home. Then Hayes stopped moving, stopped calling, just stopped. And Jimmy Crawford sat in his observation post with his binoculars and his field manual and his obedience to doctrine, and something inside him broke. That night he sat alone in his tent with a kerosene lamp and a map showing 5 German spotter positions that were killing Americans every single day. 5 positions, 12 spotters total. They were directing artillery fire that killed 7 to 15 men every day. Every single day. Hayes had a wife, had plans, had apple trees to plant. Now he had a grave with a white cross and a serial number, because Jimmy Crawford had followed orders and stayed 200 yards away. But there was something Jimmy's commanding officers didn't know. For 4 weeks, Crawford had been testing something during his night patrols. Something he developed based on how he navigated those Kentucky coal mines as a boy. He called it shadowing. The idea was both simple and insane. Instead of hiding from the enemy, you moved in their blind spots by tracking their attention patterns. You became part of their environment, a shadow that existed at the edge of their awareness, but never quite resolved into a target. It required memorizing where spotters looked and when, how often they swept sectors, when they adjusted binoculars, when they reached for radio equipment. You had to map their patterns the way Jimmy used to map tunnel sounds, then move in the gaps between their observations. Not when they weren't looking, that was impossible to predict. But when their attention was committed elsewhere, focused so completely on one sector that their peripheral awareness collapsed. He'd tested it on 4 patrols. Each time he'd gotten within 100 yards of German positions that were supposed to be impenetrable. Once he'd been so close to a machine gun nest that he could hear the gunner complaining about the cold, could hear the distinct sound of cigarette paper being rolled. He'd marked their positions, reported back, and watched as artillery plastered the coordinates he'd provided. On his last patrol, Jimmy had gotten within 15 feet of a 2-man German spotter team. 15 feet. Close enough to see the brand of cigarettes they smoked, close enough to hear them talking about a girl in Munich named Greta, close enough to kill them both with his trench knife before they could call in another barrage. But doctrine said scouts observe and report. So he observed, reported, and watched more Americans die. He wrote up a report explaining the shadow link technique, detailed observations, documented approaches, proven results. He handed it to Lieutenant Webb. Webb read it twice. Then he called Jimmy into his tent. The lamp was burning low, casting long shadows. Webb's face was tight. This is insane, Webb said. You're describing stalking techniques, not reconnaissance. It works, Jimmy replied. 4 patrols, 4 successful infiltrations. It violates every principle of scouting doctrine. You're supposed to observe and report, not infiltrate enemy positions. The positions I observed last week are the ones we destroyed with artillery, Jimmy said. 20 Germans dead. No American casualties. Webb set the report down. His jaw was tight with a kind of anger that had fear underneath it. Sergeant, I'm not questioning your results. I'm questioning your methods. What you're describing requires getting so close to enemy positions that one mistake means capture or death. We can't afford to lose scouts. We're losing entire squads, Jimmy said. Hayes is dead. Anderson is dead. Doherty, Palmieri, Hutchkins, all dead because spotters call and fire we can't stop. And if you get killed trying the shadow link technique, we lose our best scout and gain nothing. Then I won't get killed, Jimmy said. Webb stood up. His voice went formal, the voice of a man who needs the authority of rank to win an argument he's losing on the merits. I'm making this clear, Sergeant. You are forbidden from attempting this technique. That's a direct order. You will continue standard reconnaissance patrols, and you will not under any circumstances attempt to close within 100 yards of enemy positions. Understood, Jimmy understood. He understood that Webb was following doctrine because doctrine was all Webb knew, all West Point had taught him. He understood that Webb was trying to keep him alive. He understood that men would keep dying anyway. Understood, Sir Jimmy said. 2 days later, before dawn on March 14th, Jimmy Crawford loaded his pack and slipped out of camp. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, didn't file a patrol report, just walked into the darkness between the lines with a trench knife, 2 canteens and a map marked with 5 spotter positions that had been particularly deadly. He left a note on his cot. Lieutenant Webb would find it when he came looking. The note was simple: gone to do what needs doing. If I don't come back, Shadow Link works. Train someone else. If I do come back, court-martial me if you want. But the spotters will be dead. At 5:03 in the morning, Jimmy Crawford slipped past the perimeter wire. The sentry, a corporal named Davis, challenged him. Crawford, where you headed, patrol? Jimmy said. Didn't see a movement order. You're seeing me move. Davis looked at Jimmy's face, at something in his eyes, something that said this conversation was over. Davis stepped aside. Be careful out there, Davis said. Jimmy walked into no man's land. The ground between the lines was a moonscape of shell craters and barbed wire and bodies from previous assaults still lying where they fell. The smell was cordite and decomposition and wet earth from yesterday's rain. The sound was distant artillery and wind through wire in his own breathing. He had 5 targets, 5 fortified positions with 12 German spotters total. They were killing 7 to 15 Americans every day. The math was simple: 5 positions versus 1 scout. 12 enemy lives versus potentially dozens of American lives every single day. Those spotters kept working. The cost was acceptable as long as Jimmy Crawford was the one paying it. This wasn't revenge. Hayes would have wanted him to follow orders to stay safe to come home. Anderson would have told him the same. This was mathematics, cold calculation. The kind of decision you make when you've watched enough good men die for no reason, except that someone in a command tent decided doctrine was more important than results. The first position was a collapsed barn 300 yards northwest of the American lines. Jimmy had been observing it for a week. 2 spotters worked in rotation, one watching the Allied positions through binoculars, while the other monitored radio equipment. They had a schedule so precise you could set your watch by it. Every 14 minutes they swapped roles. During the handoff there was a gap, 6 seconds when both men were focused on the equipment exchange, neither watching their sectors. 6 seconds. It would have to be enough. Jimmy Crawford's route to the first position was a drainage ditch that ran 200 yards through no man's land. 3 inches of stagnant water that smelled like sewage and death. Bodies from previous fighting had fallen into it, and nobody had bothered to retrieve them. The smell was something you could taste in the back of your throat. He crawled, not the fast combat crawl they taught at Fort Benning, but something slower, something he'd learned in the mines. Elbows and knees face inches from the water, moving 2 yards every minute. His shoulders burned, his knees screamed. The water soaked through his uniform, cold against his skin, despite the Italian sun rising behind him. The sun was his ally and his enemy. It rose at his back, casting his shadow forward, but he timed his movement for when the German spotters would be looking west into the morning glare. Their eyes would be watering their vision, compromised, their attention focused on squinting into brightness rather than watching the shadows at their feet. Every few yards, Jimmy stopped. Listened. The spotters were 200 yards away, but sound carried strangely in the morning air. He could hear vehicles moving on the German supply route behind their lines. Could hear someone hammering, probably repairing a bunker. Could hear very faintly voices. After 90 minutes, he'd covered 200 yards. His elbows were bleeding through his sleeves. His knees had gone numb. His shoulders felt like someone was driving nails into the joints. But he was 20 feet from the barn's collapsed wall, close enough to hear the German spotters talking. The voices were young. One was complaining about coffee, how it tasted like mud, how he missed real Berlin coffee, the kind his mother made. The other was talking about a girl in Munich. Her name was Greta. She had blonde hair and worked in a bakery and wrote him letters that smelled like flour and cinnamon. Jimmy Crawford lay in the drainage ditch 20 feet away and listened to two enemy soldiers talk about coffee and girlfriends. They were human. They had mothers who made good coffee. They had girls who wrote letters. They were just soldiers far from home, doing a job they probably didn't choose, stuck in a war they didn't start. They were also the ones who called in the artillery that killed Hayes. Jimmy's watch read 7:05. 2 minutes until the 14-minute mark. 2 minutes until they swapped positions. He pulled himself out of the ditch, water streaming from his uniform, and positioned himself at the gap in the barn wall. 20 feet of open ground, 6 seconds to cover it. His trench knife was in his right hand, 12 inches of steel with a taped handle that fit his grip like it was made for him. At 7:07, the radio crackled. An incoming transmission from German Artillery Command. Both spotters turned toward the radio. Both focused on the equipment. The moment of complete attention commitment that Jimmy had been waiting for. He moved. 20 feet in 4 seconds. Low and fast boots barely touching ground, every muscle burning with the sudden explosive movement after 90 minutes of crawling. The first spotter started to turn his head at the last second. Some instinct, some peripheral awareness, some animal sense that says predator. His mouth opened to shout. Jimmy's knife caught him under the jaw, angled upward. The blade punched through soft palate and into the brainstem. Instant neural shutdown. The shout died before it could form. The spotter's eyes went wide, then empty. His body collapsed, and Jimmy was already moving, yanking the knife free, blood spraying warm across his hand. The second spotter was reaching for his rifle 6 feet away, leaning against the wall. His fingers were 6 inches from the stock when Jimmy drove the knife into his throat. Horizontal cut left to right, opening both carotid arteries and the windpipe. Blood sprayed across the map table, across the radio, across Jimmy's chest. The spotter fell backward, hands clawing at his throat, making a sound like water going down a drain. His boots drummed against the floor for maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. Both men dead in 8 seconds. No shots fired, no alarm raised. Just two German soldiers who'd been talking about coffee and girls now bleeding out on a barn floor in Italy. Jimmy's hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline crash after the explosive violence. His stomach convulsed, and he bent over, sure he was going to vomit. He didn't. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to move. First time killing up close. First time seeing their faces. First time feeling their blood hot against his skin. He dragged both bodies to the barn cellar and covered them with debris. Took their radio equipment and smashed it with his rifle butt, making sure every component was destroyed. Then he pulled out his map, hands still shaking, and marked Position 1 complete with his blood-stained thumb. The mark looked like a fingerprint in red ink. 1 position down, 11 more kills to go. Position 2 was an olive grove 600 yards to the east. 3 German spotters with more sophisticated equipment. Jimmy spent 2 hours observing from a shell crater 250 yards out, watching through the binoculars he'd taken from the dead Germans at Position 1. 3 men. 3 sectors. They rotated positions every 20 minutes with military precision. Spotter A watched north, spotter B watched south, spotter C coordinated with artillery batteries and took notes in a logbook. Every 20 minutes they rotated clockwise. During the rotation, all three focused inward on each other, discussing what they'd seen, handing off observations, synchronizing their coverage. 10 seconds. That's how long the rotation took. 10 seconds when all three men were looking at each other instead of at their sectors. But 10 seconds wasn't enough to cover 250 yards. Jimmy needed to get closer, much closer. The olive grove was ancient trees twisted and gnarled, their silver-green leaves rustling in the wind that came up from the coast. The wind was irregular, gusting and dying, gusting and dying. But when it gusted, the sound of those leaves was like rain, like static, like white noise that masked other sounds. Jimmy advanced in 5-yard sprints, tree to tree, moving only during wind gusts that coincided with the spotter's rotation. It was like running between shaft crews in the mine, listening for the timber creak that told you when to move so your footsteps got lost in the general noise. 250 yards to 100 yards took 45 minutes. 100 yards to 50 yards took 30 minutes. Every sprint was calculated. Every freeze was absolute stillness. His muscles cramped from the combination of explosive movement and perfect stillness. His mouth was dry. He'd finished both canteens hours ago, and dehydration was making his vision swim at the edges. 50 yards to 10 yards took 18 minutes. Now he could hear them clearly, could smell their cigarettes, could hear the rustle of paper when they wrote in their logbooks. At 11:34, 3 German spotters gathered around a map on a portable table. They were arguing, voices raised, pointing at different locations. "The American assembly area is here," one said, stabbing his finger at the map. "No 200 meters west." "I saw trucks," another replied. "Both of you are wrong," the third one said. He was older, a senior NCO voice carrying authority. "Look at the shadows. See how they fall. That puts the staging area here." All three leaned over the map. All three focused completely on proving their point. None watching their sectors. The wind gusted through the olive trees, and Jimmy Crawford came from behind like a ghost. The senior NCO never saw him, never heard him. The knife opened his throat before his brain could process what was happening. He fell forward onto the map, your blood pouring across the very coordinates they'd been arguing about. The second spotter turned, saw Jimmy, saw the knife, saw his sergeant dying. His eyes went wide. He opened his mouth, but Jimmy was already moving, already inside his reach knife, thrust between the ribs, angled upward into the heart. The spotter made a sound like a sigh and crumpled. The third spotter broke for his rifle. Not reaching for it, actually running, diving for the weapon, 6 feet away against a tree trunk. He was fast, young and scared, and fast. He got his hand on the rifle stock and was starting to swing it toward Jimmy when the knife left Jimmy's hand. 12-foot throw. The knife tumbled once in the air blade, overhandle a perfect rotation. It buried itself between the spotter's shoulder blades with a sound like an axe hitting wood. The spotter's momentum carried him forward. He crawled 2 feet, making animal sounds, hands scrabbling at the dirt. Then he stopped. 7 seconds. 3 men dead. Jimmy retrieved his knife. It took almost a minute to pull it free. The blade had lodged in the spine, and he had to brace his boot against the body and pull hard. When it came free, there was a sucking sound and more blood. Always more blood. His hands were shaking worse now. Muscle fatigue, dehydration, the beginning of something that might be shock. He smashed the radio, cut the telephone line to German artillery, drank water from a dead German's canteen because he was out and he needed water more than he needed dignity. Sat against a tree for 30 seconds, just breathing, letting his heart rate come down, letting his hands stop shaking enough to mark his map. Position 2 complete. 11:42 in the morning, 8 spotters dead, 3 positions remaining. But the next position was personal. Hill 73 rose 400 yards to the north, a barren hump of rock and scrub with a concrete pillbox on top. 2 German spotters worked from that pillbox with perfect 360-degree sight lines. 400 yards of open ground with scattered rubble. No drainage ditches, no olive groves, just exposed terrain that had already killed dozens of Americans who tried to take that hill, including Leonard Hayes. 40 yards from that pillbox, Hayes had bled out over 8 minutes calling for Martha, talking about apple trees. Jimmy had watched through binoculars, helpless, 200 yards away. Now he was going back. He studied the position from a crater 200 yards out. Studied it for 90 minutes, watching the pattern, looking for the gap. 2 spotters. One ate while the other scanned. That was the vulnerability. When one man tried to do the work of two, his sweeps became faster, less thorough, trying to cover twice the area in the same time. At 1:47 in the afternoon, one spotter set down his binoculars and unwrapped food. Bread and canned meat, Jimmy could see it even from 200 yards. The second spotter continued scanning, but now he was scanning fast, his binoculars sweeping across sectors in 3-second intervals instead of studying them properly. Jimmy moved during those fast sweeps, crawled, face in the dirt, elbows and knees. 200 yards to 150 took 18 minutes. His elbows were bleeding through the uniform fabric, now blood mixing with mud and sweat. His knees had gone past numb into something that might be actual damage. 150 to 100 took 21 minutes. The sun was high and hot. March in Italy. Mediterranean heat building towards summer. Sweat ran into his eyes, his vision blurred. He couldn't reach his canteen without raising his profile, so he just crawled and sweated and bled. 100 to 75 took 15 minutes. The spotter was eating faster now. Food break ending soon. Jimmy increased his risk, moved in 6-yard spurts instead of 3, gambling that the fast sweeps wouldn't catch movement if the movement was perfectly timed. At 75 yards, rubble shifted under his knee. Small sound, a stone scraping against another stone. The kind of sound that disappears in wind or gets lost in ambient noise. But it was a still moment, and the sound carried. The spotter paused his sweep, looked directly at Jimmy's location. Binoculars focusing, eyes searching. Jimmy froze, became rock, became dirt, became nothing. Dirt on his face acting as camouflage. His uniform the same color as Italian mud. Perfect stillness, not breathing, not blinking, just another rock in a field of rocks. The spotter stared for 10 seconds, adjusted his focus, stared some more, saw nothing. Because Jimmy Crawford had learned in Kentucky coal mines that sometimes the best hiding place is absolute stillness in plain sight. The human eye tracks movement. Stillness disappears. The spotter resumed his sweep. Jimmy breathed again. 75 to 50 took 20 minutes. 50 to the pillbox wall took the final 12 minutes of the longest crawl of his life. When he collapsed against the concrete, his vision was tunneling from exhaustion. His muscles were past burning into something like paralysis, and he could barely draw breath. But he could hear them. The 2 German spotters inside the pillbox still talking. "This heat is unbearable," one said. "Hamburg was cold," the other replied. "Pick your misery. I'd take cold. You can always add layers. Here you just melt." They talked about Hamburg, about a girlfriend named Christina who worked in a shop near the harbor, about how good German beer was compared to Italian wine. Jimmy circled to the entrance. 4 minutes to move 12 feet along the wall, inch by inch, every foot placement checked. No sound, no shadow visible through the observation slit. Just patience and pain and the knowledge that Hayes had died here on this hill because these 2 men had called in coordinates. He reached the entrance at 2:31. Dark interior, 2 silhouettes against the back wall, one eating. One adjusting radio dials, static, crackling as he tuned frequencies. Jimmy went in fast. The first spotter turned at the sound of boots on concrete, saw Jimmy, reached for his Luger on the table. 8 feet away, drawing the pistol. Fast, well-trained, not fast enough. Jimmy closed the distance in less than 2 seconds. Knife thrust to the chest between ribs into the heart. The spotter fell knocking over a chair, his pistol clattering to the floor unfired. The second spotter dropped his food and grabbed for his rifle. The Mauser was leaning against the wall 3 feet away. He got his hand on the stock, started to swing the barrel toward Jimmy. Jimmy yanked his knife free from the first spotter. Blood sprayed across the pillbox wall. He threw the knife. 12 feet. The blade tumbled once and buried itself in the second spotter's throat. The man staggered backward, hit the wall hands clawing at the knife handle, made a gurgling sound like water in a clogged drain. Slid down the wall, leaving a blood trail. Stopped moving. Both dead. No shots fired. Only sounds were Jimmy's breathing and blood dripping and wind outside. Jimmy Crawford sat down on the pillbox floor. Sat there with 2 German corpses and let himself feel it. Hayes. This was for Hayes. For apple trees that would never get planted and a wife who would get a telegram instead of a husband. This was for every American who died on this hill because these two men had been too good at their jobs. He sat for 30 seconds. Then he stood up, retrieved his knife. It took a full minute of pulling to get it out of the spotter's spine, and went back to work. Smashed the radio, destroyed every piece of equipment, marked his map with bloody fingers. Position 3 complete, 2:38 in the afternoon. 9 spotters dead, 2 positions remaining, but those 2 positions were visible from each other. If one team saw movement near the other, they'd radio a warning and German infantry would swarm the area. Jimmy needed darkness. He waited in the Hill 73 pillbox with 2 corpses for company, drank water from dead men's canteens, ate their bread because he needed calories, and squeamishness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Watched the sun track across the sky through the observation slit. Something had changed in him. That morning he'd been a soldier who was disobeying orders. Now he was something else. Something that sat calmly with the men he'd killed and ate their food and planned his next kills with the same methodical patience he'd used to navigate mine shafts. War changes you, not all at once, not with some dramatic moment of transformation. Just slowly, quietly until you look in a mirror and don't quite recognize who looks back. At 6:22 in the evening, twilight began. The sun dropped behind the Alban Hills and shadows lengthened across the battlefield. Jimmy Crawford checked his knife one last time and moved toward position 4. The 4th position was a burned farmhouse 800 yards south. 2 German spotters. Jimmy could smell their cigarettes before he saw their position. Tobacco smoke carried on the evening air. Could smell cooking, too. They were making dinner. Their guard was down. End of a long day. They'd be tired, careless. He tracked them by cigarette glow. In the gathering darkness, those glowing embers were like beacons. When the ember brightened, they were inhaling eyes closed for a fraction of a second, night vision compromised. When it dimmed, they were scanning alert. Jimmy moved during the brightening. 600 yards in an hour, faster than daylight movement because darkness was his element. This was the coal mine. This was home. This was where men with lamps were blind and Jimmy Crawford could see. At 7:47, he reached the farmhouse. Burned out walls, collapsed roof. A lamp inside creating hard shadows. 2 spotters, one asleep in a corner using his pack as a pillow, soft snoring audible, even from outside. One monitoring radio traffic sitting with his back to the door, bored attention drifting. Jimmy entered through the broken door, silent. The sleeping spotter never woke. Hand over mouth to prevent noise knife across throat life, leaving in seconds without consciousness ever returning. Clean death. Merciful if such a thing existed in war. The radio operator turned at a sound, the slight gurgle from the first kill. Turned and saw Jimmy standing there covered in blood and mud. Saw death. Reached for his pistol on the table. Too slow. Too late. Jimmy's knife punched into his chest before his hand reached the weapon. The spotter slumped over the radio, died with his eyes open, died probably wondering what had just happened. Both dead in 11 seconds. Jimmy stood in the farmhouse and breathed. 11 kills, 1 more position to go. But this time he didn't smash the radio immediately. He had an idea, a way to make the final approach easier. He keyed the microphone, transmitted random static for 30 seconds. White noise, nonsense, no voice, no message. Just static that would make the spotters at position 5 wonder what was happening, make them argue about it, make them distracted. Then he went silent, left the radio intact, left the bodies where they'd fallen, and moved toward the final position. Position 5 was a camouflage tent in a tree line 500 yards southwest. The last position, the last 2 spotters. By 8:12, Jimmy could already hear them arguing. His static transmission had worked. They'd heard it, and now they were fighting about what it meant. That would position 4, one voice said loud enough to carry. Something's wrong, probably radio malfunction, another replied. Equipment fails. We should check on them. In the dark, through minefields. Don't be stupid. Their argument grew louder. Both so focused on each other that neither was watching their sector. Their lamp was lit inside the tent, backlighting them, making them perfect silhouettes against canvas. Jimmy covered 400 yards in 18 minutes. Confident movement through complete darkness. No hesitation, no doubt. This was what he'd been born for. Running messages between shaft crews. Moving through absolute darkness. Trusting senses that most men forgot they had. At 8:47, he reached the tent. Could hear them clearly now, still arguing over maps spread on a table. Should they report the radio static? Would command think they were paranoid? What if position 4 really was compromised? Jimmy entered through the tent flap. Both men looked up, saw him, saw the American uniform, saw the mud and blood, saw their death walking toward them. Recognition flooded their faces. Understanding. Oh God, the Americans are here. The first spotter reached for his rifle, never touched it. Jimmy's knife opened his throat. Arterial spray hit the tent wall in a pattern like thrown paint. The second spotter bolted for the exit. Survival instinct. Run. Jimmy caught him from behind, one hand over mouth, silencing the scream, other hand driving the knife between ribs angled up into the heart. Held him while he convulsed. Felt the life leave. Lowered him to the ground. 8:51 in the evening. 12 hours since he'd left American lines. 5 positions, 12 German spotters, not a single shot fired. Mission complete. Jimmy stood outside the tent and felt his legs give out. Collapsed against a tree. The adrenaline that had carried him for 12 hours drained away in seconds. His hands shook so violently he could barely sheath his knife. His uniform was soaked with sweat and blood, his blood and theirs. His shoulders felt like broken glass grinding together. No regret, no guilt, just a simple thought. It's done, they can't kill anyone else. He dragged the bodies into the underbrush, covered them with branches, smashed the final radio, then sat down again because standing seemed impossible. At 9:15, he started walking back. 3 miles to American lines, too exhausted for tactical movement. Just walking, stumbling, following instinct more than memory. Passed within 50 yards of a German patrol, and they never saw him. Luck, darkness. Maybe he really had become a shadow. At 11:53 at night, he stumbled into American perimeter wire. A sentry challenged him. Halt. Who goes there, Crawford? Sergeant Crawford. The sentry almost shot him, then recognized his face under the mud and blood. Jesus Christ, Crawford. Where the hell have you been? Working, Jimmy whispered. Lieutenant Webb was waiting in his tent. Lieutenant Harrison Webb sat at his field desk with a kerosene lamp burning low and a note in his hand. Crawford's note. Gone to do what needs doing. The words were matter-of-fact, almost casual, like he was running an errand instead of walking into enemy territory alone with nothing but a knife. Webb had been sitting there for 6 hours, waiting, wondering if he should report Crawford missing or give him more time, wondering if the sergeant was dead in some German position or captured and being interrogated, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake by forbidding the shadow link technique. When Jimmy Crawford walked through the tent flap at 11:57, Webb stood up so fast his chair fell over. Where the hell have you been? Sergeant Jimmy set down his pack. The thud was heavy final. His uniform was shredded and stained dark. His knife was still sheathed, still bloody. His face was gaunt with exhaustion, streaked with mud and dried blood. He looked like something that had crawled up from hell. Patrol, Jimmy said. His voice was hoarse from dehydration. Patrol, where Webb's voice rose. You didn't file a route plan. You disappeared for 18 hours. German positions. Northwest sector. Webb stared at the blood, at the way Crawford's hands trembled slightly, at something in his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. What did you do? Jimmy pulled out his map, laid it on the desk. 5 red marks, blood stains on the edges where his thumbs had gripped it. Times noted in pencil at each position. 7:07, 11:42, 2:38, 8:04, 8:51. 5 positions marked in red, Jimmy said. 12 spotters, 5 radio stations. All eliminated, no shots fired, no Allied casualties. Webb looked at the map, looked at Crawford. His face went through several expressions. Anger, disbelief, realization, something that might have been awe. You used the shadow link technique. Yes, sir. After I explicitly ordered you not to. Yes, sir. Webb's jaw tightened. Do you understand what you've done? This is insubordination. This is a court-martial offense. I could have you shot for this. Jimmy met his eyes. No defiance, no apology. Just fact. Hayes is still dead, Jimmy said. So is Anderson, Doherty, Palmieri, Hutchkins, the 42 men from Baker Company. I couldn't bring them back. but I could stop more men from dying the same way. Silence filled the tent. Webb looked at the map again, at the tactical implications. 5 German spotter positions eliminated meant German artillery would be firing blind. No accurate coordinates, no precision bracketing. Their shells would be wasted ammunition instead of surgical strikes. "You're confined to camp pending investigation," Webb finally said. "I'm reporting this up the chain. What happens next isn't my decision." Jimmy nodded. He expected prison, expected a firing squad maybe, expected to spend whatever was left of the war breaking rocks in a stockade. He'd made his choice. 12 German spotters dead meant dozens, maybe hundreds of Americans who wouldn't die from artillery fire. The mathematics worked even if the punishment was death. "Get some rest," Sergeant Webb said quietly. "You look like hell." Jimmy walked to his tent and collapsed on his cot without taking off his boots. Slept for 4 hours. Dreamless sleep, the kind that comes after your body has nothing left. He woke to the sound of artillery, German artillery, the standard dawn barrage that had become routine at Anzio. But something was wrong. The shells were landing, scattered random without the usual precision. No bracketing, no walking fire, just blind shooting at pre-sighted coordinates that didn't account for troop movements during the night. By 8:00 in the morning, word was spreading through the American lines. Alpha Company had been ordered to probe Hill 73. Every man in that company expected to die. Hill 73 was a death trap. German spotters owned that hill. But Alpha Company reached the objective without taking artillery fire. They found the pillbox intact, found 2 German spotters inside with their throats cut, found a destroyed radio and blood on the walls. By noon, everyone knew. Someone had hit 5 German spotter positions in one night. Someone had done what doctrine said was impossible. By evening, soldiers had figured out who. Crawford, the scout from Kentucky, the crazy bastard who moved through darkness like he could see. The story spread through the division like fire through dry grass. Details got added, some true, some embellished. He killed 12 Germans with a knife, never fired a shot, got within 15 feet without being detected, did it all alone. By nightfall, James Crawford had become a legend. The statistics told a different story, a more important story. German artillery effectiveness in the Anzio sector dropped 63% in 24 hours. Daily casualty rates fell from 15 men per day to 6. In the first week after Crawford's mission, estimated American lives saved was 47. Colonel Henry Bennett, division intelligence officer, looked at those numbers and made a decision that would change military doctrine. On March 15th at 7:30 in the evening, Jimmy Crawford was escorted under guard to division headquarters. He still hadn't cleaned his uniform, still had blood under his fingernails, still looked like something death had chewed up and spit out. He stood at attention in front of Bennett's desk and waited. Bennett was late 40s West Point career officer. He studied Crawford the way a man might study an interesting bug, not with disgust, with fascination. "Sergeant Crawford," Bennett said, "you've created a significant problem." "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Webb wants you court-martialed for insubordination." "He's not wrong. You violated a direct order." "Yes, sir." Bennett set down the report he had been reading. Crawford's after-action report. Webb had written it based on the map and Crawford's verbal account. 5 positions, 12 kills, 12 hours. 0 American casualties. However, Bennett continued, in the 24 hours since you eliminated those spotter positions, German artillery effectiveness has dropped 63%. 63%, Sergeant. Do you understand what that means? Jimmy said nothing, waited. "It means you've saved more lives in one day than most soldiers save in an entire war." Bennett leaned back in his chair. "It also means we need to figure out what the hell to do with you. We can't court-martial you. Morale would collapse if word got out we're punishing the man who just crippled German artillery. But we also can't reward you for flagrant insubordination. Every sergeant in this army would think they can ignore orders whenever they disagree." Bennett let that hang in the air. Jimmy kept his face neutral. Whatever was coming, he'd accept it. "So we're going to do something else," Bennett said. "You're going to teach your technique, not to scouts, to a specialized unit. Men who can do what you did. Get close, eliminate spotters, destroy equipment, disappear. We're calling it deep reconnaissance, so you'll train them, lead them. If they're as effective as you've been, we'll expand the program across Fifth Army." Jimmy blinked, tried to process. "I'm not being court-martialed." "Oh, you're absolutely being court-martialed," Bennett said. but the sentence is suspended pending your service with the new unit. Consider it probation with extreme prejudice. You teach soldiers your shadow link technique. You lead missions, and you don't get shot. Those are the terms. Acceptable, Sir Jimmy said. Good. Report to Captain Richard Mitchell tomorrow at Oaks 100. He'll brief you on unit composition. Dismissed. Walking back to his tent, Jimmy tried to understand what had just happened. He'd expected punishment, got a command instead. They weren't disciplining him. They were weaponizing him. And warfare, he realized, had just changed. Over the next 6 weeks, Jimmy Crawford transformed 12 men into something new, something the military had never seen before. Captain Mitchell, former OSS, helped with selection. They pulled scouts who understood reconnaissance, snipers who understood patience, combat engineers who understood demolitions, and 2 specialists. One was a boxer from Chicago who knew close combat. The other was Danny Russo. Danny Russo was 22 from Brooklyn, wiry and nervous energy and fast talking. Before the Army, he'd been a burglar, a good one, broke into 40 apartments in 1940 and 1941, got caught eventually. Judge gave him a choice, prison or Army. Danny chose Army. Best decision he ever made, he'd say later. Their first meeting happened in a tent at the training area. Danny looked at Jimmy and grinned. So you're the guy who killed 12 Krauts with a knife. 11 with a knife, Jimmy said. 1 with a thrown knife. Danny's grin got wider. Big difference. Thrown knives are harder. You ever kill anyone? Jimmy asked. No, but I've snuck into a lot of places I shouldn't be. Danny shrugged. Figure that's half the job. It is, Jimmy said. Good, that's good. The training was brutal. Jimmy built mock German positions behind American lines, staffed them with division personnel, acting as spotters, equipped them with binoculars and radios. Then he taught. Before you move, you watch, he told them the first day. 2 hours minimum, map their patterns. When they sweep sectors, when they check radio, when they eat, when they scratch their ass, everything is a pattern. Find the pattern, find the gap. He demonstrated. Infiltrated a mock position in daylight while everyone watched. Got within 10 feet of the mock spotters without being seen. Came back and explained every decision. Shadow linking isn't about speed, it's about timing. You don't rush, you don't force it. You wait for the pattern to create a gap. If you force it, you die. If you wait for it, you survive. The first week, all 12 trainees got caught by the mock spotters. Every single one. They were frustrated, angry, convinced it was impossible. It was impossible for me too, Jimmy told them. The first time. But I learned. You'll learn. Week 2, 6 got caught. 6 succeeded. Week 3, they added night training. Taught them the cigarette glow technique, the sound masking the patients required to move 1 yard every 5 minutes. Week 4, only 3 got caught. The rest were succeeding consistently. Danny Russo was the best. Natural talent combined with years of breaking into apartments taught him how to move silently, how to read patterns, how to exploit moments of distraction. After one particularly successful night exercise, Danny and Jimmy sat outside their tent sharing a cigarette. In Brooklyn, I snuck past building supers. Cops, angry husbands, Danny said. But I never killed anyone. You worried about that? Worried you can't, Jimmy asked. Worried I can, too easily. Then you understand the weight, Jimmy said. That's good. That's important. Does it get easier? Jimmy was quiet for a long time, stared at the Italian sky at stars you never saw in Kentucky. No, he finally said, but you learn to carry it. On April 23rd, they ran their first operational mission. 4 German spotter positions near Cisterna were coordinating artillery fire that was stalling the Allied breakout. Division 1 of them eliminated before the main offensive kicked off at dawn. Jimmy took his team in at midnight, split into 4 pairs each targeting one position. He partnered with Danny Russo taking the most exposed site, a bell tower overlooking the main road. They reached the tower at 2:14 in the morning. 2 German spotters inside, both awake, both scanning with night vision equipment. Jimmy and Danny watched for 90 minutes mapping the pattern. Every 6 minutes, one spotter descended to the ground floor to check their supply cache. 30 seconds alone on the upper level. That was the gap. At 2:38, the first spotter descended. Jimmy went up, found the second spotter focused on his binoculars watching American lines. Knife across throat. Silent kill. Danny took the first spotter on the ground floor, caught him bent over checking supplies. Both kills clean, both radios destroyed. By 2:47, all four teams reported success. 8 German spotters eliminated, 0 shots fired, 0 American casualties. The dawn offensive launched at 4:47. German artillery fired blind. The breakout succeeded. Cisterna fell by noon. Division command requested more teams. By May, Jimmy was training 30 men. By June, every division in 5th Army had Shadow Link teams. The official designation was Deep Reconnaissance Sections. The soldiers called them Shadow Link teams, sometimes just shadows. They became legends. Quiet men with blackened faces who appeared in camps at night stayed a few days, then disappeared on missions nobody talked about. They'd return with reports of eliminated positions, destroyed equipment, enemy casualties. Wherever shadow teams operated, casualty rates dropped by an average of 41%. The Germans noticed. By July, their intelligence reports were filled with disturbing observations. Spotter networks collapsing. Positions that should have been secure eliminated overnight. Bodies found with throats cut, radios destroyed, no signs of how the attackers got close. On July 8th, a German lieutenant named Klaus Wehrer filed a report after investigating a missing spotter team near Florence. The report was found after the war in captured German files. It read like a horror story. Position intact but abandoned. Radio destroyed, smashed, not damaged by fire. Blood on floor. No bodies. They had been dragged away and hidden. No signs of combat, no shell casings. No bullet impacts. Whoever eliminated our observers did so with knives in darkness without triggering any alarm. Recommendation: immediate review of security protocols. Current defensive measures are ineffective against this form of infiltration. The report was filed and largely ignored. German doctrine hadn't changed since 1918. They couldn't adapt fast enough. By August, German spotter casualties in Italy had reached crisis levels. Artillery effectiveness continued declining. But success brought scrutiny. On September 3rd, Jimmy was summoned to Corps headquarters. A new general had arrived from Washington. General Theodore Caldwell, fresh from the Pentagon West Point, educated, no combat experience. He'd read the reports on Shadow Link teams and decided they violated the rules of warfare. These tactics are assassination, not combat, Caldwell said. Jimmy stood at attention in front of the general's desk. Captain Mitchell was there too, looking uncomfortable. "With respect," Sir Mitchell began. "You're encouraging soldiers to murder enemy personnel in their sleep," Caldwell interrupted. "That's not soldiering, that's butchery." Jimmy spoke quietly. "German spotters direct artillery fire that kills our men by the dozen. They do it from positions we can't reach with conventional tactics. Shadow linking gets us close enough to stop them. If that's butchery, then I'm a butcher. But Hayes, Anderson, Doherty, they're still dead because we followed conventional tactics." Caldwell's face reddened. "I don't need a lecture on tactics from a sergeant." "Then don't lecture me on morality," Sir Jimmy said. The words came out before he could stop them. "Every man I've killed was killing us first. That's not murder. That's war." Silence fell like a hammer. Mitchell closed his eyes. Jimmy knew he'd just ended his career. You didn't talk back to generals. You didn't challenge their judgment. You certainly didn't tell them they were wrong. But Caldwell surprised everyone. He leaned back in his chair and studied Jimmy for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. "You're right." Long pause. "And I hate that you're right. War is ugly. Sometimes the ugliest tactics are the most effective." Caldwell stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the Italian countryside. "I'm not shutting down your program, Sergeant. But I want clear rules of engagement. Shadow Link teams target spotters, radio operators, and forward observers only. No general infantry, no rear echelon personnel. You kill the men who are directing fire at our troops and nobody else. Maintain that distinction, or I will shut this down and court-martial everyone involved." "Understood." "Understood," Sir Jimmy said. And Caldwell kept his word. The program continued, expanded. By the time the Italian campaign ended in May 1945, Shadow Link teams had eliminated over 400 German spotters, destroyed countless radio stations, and reduced enemy artillery effectiveness by an estimated 58% across all operational sectors. Conservative estimates credited the program with saving between 800 and 1,200 American lives. James Crawford received no medal, no commendation, no official recognition. His name appeared only in classified after action reports that remained sealed for 50 years. On May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany surrendered, Jimmy Crawford was discharged from the Army with the rank of Staff Sergeant. He took a bus back to Kentucky, returned to Harlan County like nothing had happened. He got a job working construction, then went back to the coal mines in 1948 because that's what men did in Harlan County. He married Helen, a woman who worked at the diner on Main Street. They had 3 children, Robert in 1948, Margaret in 1951, James Jr. in 1954. He was a good father, present, kind, but sometimes his mind went somewhere else, somewhere his family couldn't follow. He never talked about the war, not to Helen, not to his children, not to anyone. When people asked, and they did ask, sometimes he'd just say he did some scouting in Italy. That was all. Nothing about Shadowlink. Nothing about 12 men killed in 12 hours. Nothing about the 400 others killed by teams he trained. Nothing about the weight of 35 lives taken with his own hands. But every year on March 14th, the phone would ring. Danny Russo calling from New York, where he ran a successful locksmith business. The conversation was always the same. Crawford Russo, March 14th, I know. You still having the dreams. Sometimes sometimes, long pause. The pause said more than words could. You okay managing, you same. Just wanted to check, appreciated. Talk next year. They never talked about what they'd done, never named the things that haunted them. But the call itself said everything. We're still here. We're still carrying it. We're not alone. On January 4th, 1987, James Crawford died in a hospital in Lexington. Heart attack. He was 62 years old. The end came quickly, no suffering. His obituary in the Harlan Daily Enterprise was 4 paragraphs long. One paragraph mentioned his military service. Mr. Crawford served with distinction in the United States Army during World War. Stationed in Italy with the 3rd Infantry Division. No mention of Shadowlink, no mention of 35 enemy killed, no mention of 1,200 lives saved. Just another veteran gone. Just another member of what people were starting to call the greatest generation. His funeral was January 8th. 70 people attended. Family, friends, co-workers from the mine. And in the back of the church, standing together but not sitting, were 12 men. They didn't introduce themselves to the family, didn't explain their connection. They just stood there, silent, respectful. Men in their 60s now, but still carrying themselves like soldiers. After the burial, one of them approached Helen. He was gray-haired, dignified, wearing a suit that had seen better days. "Your husband saved my life," the man said. His voice was rough with emotion. "Probably saved it a dozen times, just wanted you to know that." "He never talked about it," Helen said. "He wouldn't have. That was Jimmy. Did the work, came home, moved on." The man, Captain Mitchell, retired, shook her hand and walked away. Helen watched the 12 men leave together, wondered what they'd done with her husband, wondered what weight they all carried that made them stand in the back instead of sitting down. In 2003, a military historian named David Richardson was researching Italian campaign tactics when he found a reference to specialized reconnaissance sections in a declassified Fifth Army report. The details were sparse but intriguing. He spent 4 years tracking down veterans, reading after action reports, piecing together the story of Shadowlink teams. His book, published in 2007, was titled Silent Hunters: Deep Reconnaissance in the Italian Campaign. An entire chapter was dedicated to James Crawford. Richardson did the mathematics. Shadowlink tactics operational for 18 months. Artillery effectiveness reduction of 11% across the entire Italian campaign. American casualties in Italy, approximately 15,000 deaths. 11% of 15,000 was 1,650 soldiers. Richardson's conservative estimate, accounting for other tactical factors, was 1,600 men who came home instead of dying on Italian hillsides. 1,600 fathers who met their children. 1,600 husbands who came home to their wives. 1,600 lives saved because a coal miner from Kentucky learned to move in shadows and taught others to do the same. Today, every special operations unit in the American military uses principles that James Crawford discovered in Italian darkness. Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Army Rangers. Pattern mapping is formal doctrine. Attention gap exploitation is taught in special warfare schools. Close target reconnaissance is standard operating procedure. Military analysts have written papers on the shadow link concept, how infiltration via cognitive blind spots rather than physical concealment changed warfare. Crawford didn't invent stealth, he invented something subtler. He understood that humans can't watch everything at once, that attention has limits, that those limits create vulnerabilities. And he used that understanding as a weapon. There's a grave in Harlan County, Kentucky. Simple headstone. James Crawford, 1924 to 1987, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. Nothing about Shadowlink. Nothing about changing warfare. Nothing about 1,600 lives saved. Just a name and dates and rank. Every year on March 14th, fresh flowers appear on that grave. Nobody knows who puts them there. Could be Danny Russo flying in from New York. Could be one of the other team members, the one still alive. Could be someone else entirely. Someone whose father came home from Italy because a coal miner decided that following orders was less important than saving lives. That's how innovation happens in war. Not through committees examining doctrine and writing new field manuals. Not through generals in headquarters planning elegant strategies. Through sergeants who watch their friends die and decide they won't watch anymore. Through men who break rules because the rules are killing people. Through techniques developed in darkness and taught in whispers because official channels move too slow and men are dying too fast. Shadowlink violated doctrine, violated tactical theory, violated the career officer's sense of how warfare should be conducted cleanly from a distance with proper authorization. But it worked. And in war, working matters more than anything else. James Crawford understood that. So he did what needed doing, accepted the consequences, and went home when it was over. No fanfare, no glory, no medals. Just the quiet knowledge that he'd done something that mattered. That 1,600 men saw their families again because he'd been willing to walk into darkness with nothing but a knife. And in the end, that was enough.